great pleasure to speak to you today as part of this distinguished panel. I wish to thank the International Association of Tamil Journalists, or IATAJ, which has organized this forum. I also wish to thank the individual sponsors who have backed this effort through their varied contributions, all coming together to create this event. So why are we here? We are here because such an exchange of ideas and opinions is impossible in Sri Lanka today. The trend of suppressing free institutions, including the media, which began in the 1970s, has continued, reaching an all-time high in the past 5 years or so. Therefore, any exchange of political ideas other than those which the Colombo regime supports is best undertaken overseas. Having said that, we have to also understand that sections of the Tamil media which has been strongly critical of the Sri Lanka government's handling of the Tamil question have come under particularly vicious attack. The reason for such sustained attack is obvious. Sri Lanka's ruling establishment believed that Mullivai had sounded the death knell on any Tamil future other than a future dictated or supported by the majority Sinhalese. What emerged when the fighting ended came as a surprise to the Sri Lankan Sinhala leaders, because not only did the Tamils pursue their right to determine their political future more keenly, but they also focused their unremitting attention on something else: accountability. Accountability for the multitude of human rights violations committed and continuing to be committed against them. So, the Sri Lanka government targets the Tamil media because it plays a crucial role in keeping in the public sphere certain central political concerns for the Tamils, despite the harsh restrictions imposed by censorship. I think we could examine these concerns under two headings. A, the quest for robust political institutions that better protect Tamil freedoms and allows them to participate better in the political process. And B, the Tamils campaign for accountability for the violation of their rights. But we should know the Tamils' aspirations to determine their political future and to see that their tormentors are held accountable does not only involve the media. It can be realized only through a social and political process in which the media plays a part. It might be an important part and guiding role, but it will be in conjunction with other forces at work. The process, if we simplify it, has basically two important set of actors playing critical roles. These roles are not mutually exclusive, but are interconnected, each supporting and enriching the other. The first set of actors, of course, are Tamils living in the island of Sri Lanka and Sinhalese and Muslims who support them. The second are Tamils living outside Sri Lanka. This group includes Tamils living in Tamil Nadu, Malaysia, Mauritius, and other countries with significant Tamil populations. And also the diaspora of the Tamils of Sri Lanka and important pockets of Sinhalese, many of them activists and journalists who support them. I am conscious of the crucial, indeed seminal role that is played by Tamils within Sri Lanka and their brethren who support them from among the Sinhala and the Muslim communities in their quest for a far more meaningful political institutions and for accountability. But my speech will not be focused on that. There are many people here who either live in Sri Lanka or have visited Sri Lanka more recently than when I departed from its shores, and who are better placed to give a more comprehensive account as to what that role should be. What I would like to do in the rest of my time is to speak a little about the Tamil diaspora and how we could enrich the social and political processes towards the twin goal of effective political structures and accountability. To do that, I will use some of the experience I have had when speaking about the issues concerning Tamils of Sri Lanka in the US. I do not think that my experience is necessarily universal, nor do I have a tightly knit argument to put forth. What I hope this would do is to provoke some questions in the audience. Such a dialogue will, I think, contribute, if but in a small measure, to the conversations we should be having, and which the media should lead. One of the issues that comes up when you try addressing the Tamil question in the US, and I suspect in other parts of Western Europe as well, is the centrality of the 13th Amendment to any political settlement to satisfy Tamil aspirations. It is sacrosanct. It is the pivot around which the debate revolves. Many believe that the 13th Amendment is a mantra for the Tamils to win back their rights and equip them with adequate political power to participate as equal citizens in the political process. What many people fail to understand is that the 13th Amendment is already in the statute and has been in existence for the most part of Sri Lanka's civil war. But it has proved utterly inadequate as a power-sharing mechanism. In fact, even those who seriously believe that it might provide some answers to power sharing if fully implemented have recommended substantial changes, such as the recommendation of Committee A of the All Parties Representative Committee, or APRC, in 2006. What we have to understand is that fundamentally the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of Sri Lanka merely devolves power in certain areas of competence to the 9 provinces, of which only 2 are Tamil speaking. The powers include some control over the recruitment of the junior ranks of the police and over provincial land, both with the government refusing to allow implementation at this time. The public debate today is that if these functions are allowed, the northern and eastern provinces will be able to pursue their developmental and political goals without interference from the centre. I do not want to spend time on arguing the merits and demerits of different types of political power sharing. Suffice it to say that devolution under a unitary constitution, as Sri Lanka is, does not satisfy Tamil aspirations to participate meaningfully in the political process or help Tamils to exercise their rights completely. This is because final control of even the devolved subjects remains in the hands of the central government. This includes the power of the governor, who is the representative of the central government, to veto bills passed by the elected provincial assembly, emergency rule to suspend the legislature if the governor feels that it is necessary to impose central government rule, and others that limit the development goals set up by the central government. We have seen the control the governor exercises over the NPC in the past year as an example. While legal and constitutional powers are one issue, the other is political culture. In the 60+ years of independence, we have witnessed governments in Colombo pursuing a policy of repression and discrimination against the towns. At times they have intensified, at others they have waned. But Colombo's ruling establishment have regarded the Tamils as the other and Tamil leaders as troublemakers. In a country where such political culture rules, to believe that singular presidents and singular majority parliaments will not use their power to dominate the Tamils, especially the northern and eastern provinces, is naive. What are needed are checks and balances in the provincial council system to prevent such a culture from corrupting the independence of institutions, not weak institutions that succumb under that culture. To my mind, the 13th Amendment is inadequate as a system of power sharing for the Tamils to better participate meaningfully in Sri Lanka's political system. But the international community perceives it as a yardstick to measure whether there is adequate power sharing or not. To them, full implementation, whatever that means, of the 13th Amendment means that Tamil political aspirations have been met. I believe there are 2 reasons for the unshakable faith the international community seems to be having in the 13th Amendment. The first is that of India's consistent advocacy that devolution within the unitary government, as per the 13th Amendment, is all that the Tamils can be permitted to enjoy. Changing that perception will require a huge effort in which, hopefully, our brethren from Tamil Nadu will play a big role. The second reason for the international community to be fixated on the 13th Amendment is because many organizations of the Tamil diaspora look at the answer to inadequate devolution under the 13th Amendment as a separate state. No alternatives in between are offered. The problem is that the moment a separate state is mentioned in the US, and I believe in other parts of Western Europe too, you have lost your audience. Now, I'm not suggesting even for a moment that peaceful secession is not an option. I'm not suggesting that there are no precedents in history that make it unjustified for the Tamils to have a state of their own. Nor am I saying there is no moral argument for a separate state. All I am saying is that we should be more inclusive in the types of political models we are prepared to examine, to debate and comment on. That gives our political worldview greater sophistication. Eventually, it might be secession that the Tamils choose. But the Tamil diaspora organization, pushing secession to the exclusion of other options to decision makers in the international community right now, only make both parties speak past each other. Therefore, the diaspora and hopefully Tamil political parties working in Sri Lanka, while showing up the 13th Amendment for its hollowness as a model for effective power sharing, could be open enough to say that other models should be tried too, while of course keeping secession as an option. Now let me go to the second issue that is of paramount concern to the Tamils, accountability. Now we all know that the government of Sri Lanka and the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Ulam and the other Tamil groups, guerrilla groups, as well as the paramilitary forces working with the government, have committed grave human rights violations throughout these 30 years of civil war. As such, they all should be held accountable. Further, and worse, rights violations by the government and the paramilitary continue. However, due to the sheer level of savagery during the final few months of the civil war, it is this period that has kindled the public abhorrence and called for an investigation into war crimes and crimes against humanity. The evidence gathered by sections of the Tamil diaspora and many singular journalists and activists in support of this, in many ways, is unprecedented. This has today resulted in an international investigation by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the conduct of both the LTTE and government troops. The interim report was presented in September, and the final report is expected in March of 2015. As we all know, while the international investigation is important, it is not the be-all and end-all of accountability. What is unfortunate is that the international community, meaning in this instance Western democracies and their supporters, appear to be quite content to allow the OHCHR probe and little else. And that, as we all know, is hardly sufficient. That is because even after the report is presented in March, the UN Human Rights Council is expected to vote on follow-up action. That will involve diplomatic maneuvering and political bargaining, and the government of Sri Lanka has begun doing that already. With Sri Lanka not a signatory to the Rome Statute, the case cannot go directly before the International Criminal Court. Therefore, dealing effectively with the perpetrators will depend on the vagaries of international politics. So, what we can see is that for the near future at least, other than a credible, legitimate international panel, as the OHCHR panel is, listing patterns of deliberate violations and chain of command in its report, very little more is going to happen. Hopefully, the perpetrators will at least be named, but we do not know that for sure. If they are indeed named and shamed, it will undermine the credibility of the Rajapaksa regime and its legitimacy in the eyes of its constituents. But realistically, if advantage is to be taken of that situation to bring about accountability, there will have to be other diplomatic and political initiatives set in motion by the international community. Let me go back once again to my US experience to illustrate. When you speak to diplomats, legislative staffers, and others in Washington, D.C. about applying pressure on Colombo, they point to the UN Human Rights Council resolution sponsored by the US government. Now, that was a great initiative and we are grateful for it. But that cannot be the be-all and end-all of diplomatic efforts concerning the government of Sri Lanka. What is amazing is that when you try to steer the conversation to what steps other than the UNHCR resolution can be taken, you hear the refrain, the US has no leverage. That just cannot be. While the UN is a collective multilateral body, individual countries have bilateral leverage as well. There are a number of areas where the US does have leverage. The US and the Western European countries are the biggest importer of Sri Lanka's largest export garments. Travel bans could be imposed on a much wider range of Sri Lankan government officials than it is today. At present, under the Leahy Amendment, military personnel involved in units accused of war crimes cannot enter the US for training. But that has to be expanded to include more people for which legislation is already in place in the US, such as the expansion of the Magnitsky Act. To US diplomats and the few US legislators interested in Sri Lanka, the phrase, the US has no leverage, is usually followed by, we have to engage. This means that rather than treat the Sri Lanka government as a pariah, they wish to resume business as usual while preaching to Colombo the errors of its ways. In fact, there is a US Senate resolution before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee calling upon the President of the USA, and I quote, to develop a comprehensive and well-balanced policy towards Sri Lanka that reflects US interests, including human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, as well as economic and security interests. Close quote. So we know that does not work. The more pressure applied on the Colombo regime by exclusion, sanctions, and travel bans by the international community, the better it is. It is not the other way around. But there it is. I am told there is similar resistance in countries in Western Europe, despite the enormous leverage they possess by threatening to impose wider travel bans, sanctions through trade in garments, and tourism. So why is this? Why is it that Western democracies, by and large, believe that a political settlement is only the implementation of the 13th Amendment and accountability only the OHCHR investigation? The reason is very simple. As in other situations, there is a contest whether individual national interest lies in enforcing norms for bad behavior by blacklisting a country for the criminal conduct of its leadership, or take the easy way out by being pragmatic, which means invest, trade, and resume diplomatic relations, etc., with the regime of war criminals, with a wink and a nod. It is the second that the Rajapaksa regime is hoping for, and for which it is using Chinese investments, arms exports, and regional presence as bait. India has long fallen for it, grumbling that Colombo is moving deeper and deeper into Beijing's sphere of influence, but in its actions giving in to the whims of the Rajapaksa. It appears that important groups in the West believe this too, and could very well follow New Delhi and the new BJP ministry's lead. It is here, I think, that the Tamil diaspora and sections of the Sinhalese who have supported it can do much better. I think every opportunity should be used to lobby countries in Western Europe and the US that engaging with Sri Lanka by enhancing their ties with the Rajapaksas is not going to work. The structures and institutions in place in Sri Lanka today have been perverted by a long war, impunity, and a system of abuse that cannot be undone by calling for cosmetic changes. If there is going to be real emancipation of the Tamil people, change has to be effective. It has to be effective to check the central government's powers by the provincial authorities, at least in some areas. This can be done either by creating strong institutions of check and balance under the present constitution, or devising a new product with shared sovereignty and other federal features, which admittedly is a more difficult task. This role of pressuring the international community can be played by the Tamil diaspora. Because do not forget how far it has come from when, soon after the fighting ended in May 2009, it was portrayed as unreliable, politically immature, and at best a tool in the hands of governments and international NGOs to do their bidding. Today, all that has been disproved. If political change has to come in Sri Lanka, the most important thing is that pressure has to be relentless. And while governments and even some international NGOs have flip-flopped on some crucial issues, it has been the consistency of the diaspora that has channeled the energies and arguments that has, in fact, forced the international community to do even this little. And just how formidable the diaspora has become for the regime in Sri Lanka is seen by the new laws that sought to place 16 organizations and 424 individuals on the list of terrorists. Now you may ask, where does all this fit in a meeting of journalists? I think it does. It is because journalism engages the public to have conversations. And more people engage in that conversation, the better. And newspapers, the internet, television and radio are ideal vehicles for this conversation. But there are other instruments, but there have to be other instruments too. The diaspora has to have multiple voices through organizations, media outlets and personalities. All opinions have a right to be expressed and have to be respected. But unless we realize the importance of forging a common understanding, but not a single position, on important issues, we will find it difficult to influence international actors decisively, which will only be detrimental to the country.